Thank you, Crystal. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Salma Uribe. I am one of the training and development specialists here at ISAC. Today, we will be going over a scenario-based approach to financial aid. We will be using polls today, but bear with me because polls came back on WebEx, so we're still, trial and error. So if I make a mistake, I apologize in advance, but we will be using polls today for your interaction. Before we begin the meeting, as you all heard, this meeting will be recorded and it will be posted on our webpage. It's also posted on our YouTube page if anyone is curious, or if it's harder to navigate the PD webpage, then you can also go to the YouTube page. If you are having trouble connecting through audio through your computer, and you have a friend on this webinar, just let them know, or if your friend is having a hard time hearing, just let them know they can use the call me option for audio. You can also, we encourage you to use the Q&A features for questions. The chat has been disabled, so any questions that you may have, please enter them into the Q&A. It's going to be on the right-hand side. It's a little square with a little question mark. You can also view any upcoming offerings on our PD Trainings Workshop webpage. We have had quite a few trainings these past 2 months, September and October. As one of my colleagues used to say, we were on tour. And then continuation education, CE, and professional PD hours will be available after the webinar. For today's agenda, we will be going over the aid eligibility and dependency overview. We'll be going over some scenarios, as I mentioned before, with the polls, with the aid eligibility and dependency. Oh, that was erased. Sorry about that. Parental, and the asset investment questions, and financial information. And then I also just realized our mission statement did not come up, but let me backtrack a little bit. If you don't know who we are already, we are the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. Our mission is to make education beyond high school accessible and affordable for Illinois students. We are a state agency that provides certain scholarships and grants. If you're familiar with the MAP grant, ISAC administers that. And then here in the training and development side of things, we offer trainings on just navigating the financial aid process, helping underrepresented students, those first-gen students. We also offer, we offer a variety of trainings, right? We like financial aid process, but we also offer trainings on understanding certain loan options. But that's my whole spiel. Now, getting back into the presentation, will be our agenda for today. So the eligibility requirements of financial aid, and just keep in mind, these are the eligibility requirements for the student to qualify for federal financial aid: having a high school diploma or equivalent, being a U.S. citizen or being a eligible non-citizen, having a valid social security number, being enrolled in an eligible degree or certificate program, making satisfactory academic progress, or as we know as SAP, and signing a certification statement on the FAFSA. So these are the eligibility requirements in order for a student to be considered for aid. Now, let's say you are working with eligible non-citizens, which just means they're not U.S. citizens, but they are eligible for the FAFSA. They do have to provide an alien registration number, which is known as their A number. Now, keep in mind, most of these will have they have to have a social security number, whether it's they have to create their studentaid.gov with this social security number. They don't create their studentaid.gov account with the A number, because remember, these students need a social security number to create their account. Later on in the application, it's going to ask for that A number, so then that's when they would enter it. But they do not create an account with an A number. I know sometimes in the field we get some questions about this, so I just wanted to make sure we address that. So if they would be considered an eligible non-citizen if they have a U.S. permanent resident card, a conditional green card holder, a holder or of arrival departure record I-94 from the Department of Homeland Security, from DHS, with the designation on under refugee, asylum granted, parolee if paroled for a minimum of 1 year and has not expired, a T visa holder, so that could be a T1, T2, T3. There's a Cuban Haitian entrant, the holder of a valid certification of from the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, victims of human trafficking, and then the Afghan special immigrant lawful permanent residents. With the dates are quite changed, but it's July 2022 through September 2023. Those are the new updated dates. Just keep in mind that the parent citizenship status does not affect the student's eligibility. So as I mentioned earlier, the student would need to be the one that qualifies for aid. Therefore, they would need to be the one holding either this sort of document. Now, the documents need to be current. They cannot be expired. So if you are working with students who haven't renewed their I-94, for example, right? Before even submitting their application, they need to make sure that that document has been renewed in order for them to be considered for aid. So if, for example, I always like to use that I was working with a student a few years ago who their I-94 was expired, but their court date was just around the corner. All the student did was wait and hold off until their court date came by. Once they got their renewal for their I-94, they were able to submit a FAFSA. Now, if you are working with students who are not eligible non-US citizens, you would then refer them to look at those pre-screening questions for the alternative application to see if they're eligible for that. But even still, if you have students who are not sure which application to use, the alternative application will go through some questions and it'll determine whether they file the FAFSA or the alternative app. But a good rule of thumb, I mean, just having this list come in handy, asking students if they know what their, for example, their I-94 designation is, because some of them don't. And just keep in mind that students under TPS are not FAFSA eligible, so they would not submit an application. So it's really important to see what that I-94, that designation under the I-94 is. Students with deferred action for childhood arrivals, known as DACA. So DACA grants two things: a 2-year deferral or removal procedures, but no status. So DACA is not a pathway to citizenship. It does provide them with an eligible work permit and a social security number for work purposes. Students with DACA are not eligible for federal student aid. However, DACA recipients can complete a FAFSA. Now, we know that this is, I mean, we still talk about it because there are still students out there who do have DACA, but with DACA, students would then be referred to see if they're eligible for the alternative application. However, we do leave this here because, for example, outside of Illinois, there are other states that still need DACA students to complete the FAFSA in order to award institutional aid. So that's why DACA students can complete the FAFSA. However, they would note on the FAFSA that they are non-eligible non-US citizens on the application. With dependency status, it's based on the student's personal circumstances, and that based on that, it'll determine whether they are a dependent student or independent student. Now, most of the students that you all might work with, if you are, for example, high school counselors, college and career coaches, most of those students would be dependent students unless they did otherwise. The FAFSA will go through those dependency questions that will determine whether they are a dependent or independent, and we'll see those, not the exact questions, but we'll touch on those points briefly. So again, student will answer no to all the dependency questions. The student information, then they would need their student information, but they would also need parent information. Independent, maybe so it'll be the students are considered dependent until the age of 24, as I mentioned earlier. So if they can answer no to all those, so if they answer no to all those dependency questions and they're not above the age of 24, then they would be considered dependent. Independent, let's just say, for example, there are students that are above the age of 24, regardless if they're going for their first bachelor's degree or not, because they're above the age of 24, so they're 25, for example, they would be considered independent. Um, if you're working with high school students and they answer yes to those dependency questions, then they won't be required to report parent information. It would just be reporting information for themselves. But if the student is married, then it'll require some spouse information as well. So as I just mentioned in the previous slide, so the student is age of 24 years or of age or older by December 31st of the school year for which aid is requested. If the student is married, they could also be considered they're considered independent, but they have to be married or separated but not divorced. The student is working on graduate or professional degree. So if the student is working on their master's degree, they can go ahead and be considered independent. So for example, if students graduate college at the age of, I want to say 21, right? And then they proceed to go to get their master's right away, then they would be considered independent because they're going to get their master's. So that age requirement wouldn't factor in just because they're going to go get their graduate or professional degree. But again, a good rule of thumb is just if they're not this is a good rule of thumb. So if they're not over the age of 24, they're not married, they're not going to get their master's, and they can't answer yes to any of the dependency questions, they will need parent information. So just those 4 brief steps. With the dependency questions for students and children of dependents, if the students has children or dependents who live with them, they would need to receive more than 50% of the financial support from the student now between July 1st of 2026 and June 30th of 2027. So this is a good example is basically if you are working with students who have a dependent, right, or a child, and the parent is the one that provides rent, provides food, clothing, then that the parent is the one that's providing more than half of the support. Therefore, the student can't be considered independent because they're not the ones providing that 50% of the support. However, if they are, right, if the student is living on their own, paying their own rent, taking care of their own house bills, everything else, then this is when they would be considered independent students. For the military questions, if a student is an active duty member of the U.S. Armed Forces for other than state or training purposes, or if the student is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces, they must have served on active duty and been released under a condition other than dishonorable. So if you are working with students that are going into the military or are in the military, making sure that they read and it's not just because they're going away on like for state training purposes, right? But if they are planning to head to the military, then making sure checking in with the recruiter, seeing what those specifications are. Sometimes students who are going into the military aren't even required to file a application. So just letting the student know, or yeah, telling the student to check in with the recruiter, seeing what they're required of them, and after that, the student can make a decision either whether to file for the FAFSA or not. But if they will, then if they do have to file for one, then that's when they would answer one of these questions, dependency questions. For the students with biological parents, if the student is an orphan not living with biological or adoptive parents in foster care or a ward of the court, they have to be, it would be at any time at or after the student turned the age of 13. So if it was before this, right? So if the student was in foster care at the age of like 7, for example, when they were adopted at the age of 7, then they would need their adoptive parents' information because this wasn't at or after the age of 13. There's also, I remember we just recently had a question regarding a student who was adopted at the age of 15, but they were in foster care at the age of 13 already, so therefore they would be considered an independent student. So it varies. I know that age of 13 tends to throw a lot of people off, but just keep in mind it's at or after the age of 13. If the student is emancipated, so this has to be determined by the court of the student's state of legal residence, right? So if it was in Illinois, it has to be stated by a court in Illinois. Emancipation just means the student is divorcing their parents, so they are just cutting ties, right? Because either the student is self-sufficient, they can support each other themselves financially, and they're getting that emancipation from their parents, for whatever other reasons as well. But again, it has to be that legal document that's provided. It can't be just because the student says, right, or because the student is self-sufficient and they just want to separate from their parents, but there isn't a legal court document to prove that, then the student can't be considered emancipated. Then the student has a legal guardian other than the parents as determined by a court in the student's state of legal residence. This one is a very common one out in the field that I've seen a lot. So if students do have legal guardians, making sure that it is determined by the court and it's not just, oh, my parents left, so they left me, they left my grandma, right, as my legal guardian. But it's not truly, it wasn't never determined by the court. So making sure that the student has that court determination. If the student does have that court documents and they do indeed have a legal guardian, the legal guardian's information would not go on the FAFSA. The student would just be considered independent. So as long as they have that court document stating that, the student can select yes to or check off that dependency question, and not being required to provide parent information. And then just a key reminder, legal guardians are not considered parents. For unaccompanied homeless youth, if a student is unaccompanied homeless youth with a determination from one of the following sources, so a director or designee of an emergency or transitional shelter, street outreach program, or homeless youth drop-in center, or other programs serving those who are experiencing homelessness, students with high school or school district homeless liaison or designee, a director or designee of a director or project supported by a federal TRIO or GEAR Up program grant, or a financial aid administrator, an FFA or FAA. So this list has expanded over the years. I remember a few years back, it was just that homeless district liaison. So it definitely has opened up. It's been more flexible for students to be able to obtain this determination letter. Now, keep in mind, the student does need to be meeting both definitions of unaccompanied and homeless. So they need to be meeting those, right? So they can't just be homeless, and they can't just be unaccompanied. So they have to be meeting both of those determinations in order to be considered a unaccompanied homeless youth. And then if you are, a good rule of thumb is also making sure that when the student submits the FAFSA, that they already have that determination letter by the homeless district liaison. It just will make things easier. However, if they don't have it and they need to get one, that's not an issue as well. As I mean, like I said, the list has expanded over the years, but just to avoid any, the student forgetting or any hiccups, making sure that the student has that beforehand. So based out of how they answer the questions on the FAFSA, it'll then let them know at the end their dependency status. So if they answered no to all those dependency questions, they're not married, they're not above the age of 24, then it'll let them know, like, you're, based on how you answered the questions, you're considered a dependent student. That means you need to provide parent information. After that, it'll prompt them the following question, and it'll ask them if the parents are refusing to provide their information on the FAFSA. The student will then select no if the parents are willing or are contributing to their form, right? You do have those instances where sometimes parents do refuse to provide that information on the FAFSA, and this is one of the options that the student has, which is those direct unsubsidized loans only. And those are unfortunate situations. The student would then select yes, but if the parents are willing to contribute, the students would select no. Now, I just want to shout out to this question because the Department of Ed switched it up with, I remember like of the year before and the year after that, this question was really confusing for students because it would say apply for direct unsubsidized loan only. It's been updated to direct unsubsidized loan only, and the question is much more clear, so students won't select yes. A few years, 2 years ago, this was probably the number one reason that students would get selected, or not selected, but students would have to go back and make corrections because then they would accidentally answer yes to this question when realistically it was no. So this question has been updated to become more clear for students. And again, most students who are dependent will select no to this answer or question. If the student has an unusual circumstance where the parent is unable to provide their information, students may be eligible under the unusual circumstance and may be considered a provisionally independent student. However, there are certain reasons, right? So unacceptable reasons for an unusual circumstance would be the parents unwilling to provide information. So sometimes you have parents that are just refusing. That's not a qualifying reason to be eligible for an unusual circumstance. Parents refusing to pay for college. A common one that we see out in the field is parents do not claim students on taxes. So in some scenarios or situations, you'll see that parents will let you know, oh, well, I'm not claiming him as or her as a dependent on my taxes. They're filing their taxes on their own. So they believe, right, because they're separating them from the tax information, then their information doesn't have to go on the FAFSA. But we know that for financial aid purposes, how they file their tax information does not have anything to do with how their information needs to be reported on the FAFSA. Or student does not live with the parent. So again, if the student is self-sufficient, let's just say they have their own house, right? They pay their own mortgage. Because the student is not married, they're not above the age of 24, and they can't answer yes to any of those dependency questions, they would still need to provide parent information. The unusual circumstance would be for those students who it poses a risk for the student to contact the parent, right? So if the student left home due to an abusive or threatening environment, if they are abandoned by or estranged from their parents, have a refugee or asylee status, and are separated from their parents, or their parents are displaced in a foreign country, are a victim of human trafficking, are incarcerated, or their parents are incarcerated and contact with the parents would pose a risk to the student, or are unable to contact or locate their parents. So in those rare situations where you do have parents or students that are not sure where their parents are, they're not able to contact their parents, then they could answer yes to this question. However, they would be considered a provisionally independent student, and it would let them know like their institution, they need to follow up with their institution to provide any supporting documentation. Again, so if the student does not provide any parent information, they can continue completing the FAFSA without it. Um, the student will then receive a provisionally student aid index. The student aid index will not be generated if, for example, the student does not provide that consent, or so if the student does not provide that consent to the direct data exchange. The students will also only be eligible for those unsubsidized loans because the parents are not willing to contribute to that to the FAFSA. So they would only be eligible for those unsubsidized loans, which is the question that we saw earlier, especially if they can't even be considered for an unusual circumstance. Students unable to provide parent information do have to follow up with a financial aid office. if the student files as provisionally independent, they would have to then follow up with the financial aid office to see what documentation is required of them, right? An example that some financial aid offices may require of the student is any documentation like letters of support. If there are, let's say, if the student is fleeing an abusive environment, if the student has any records of, any police records or anything else, maybe the counselor provided some documentation, any type of supporting documentation that the student can get prior to contacting the institution to help with their situation, so that the institution can provide that dependency override. So this was the message I was speaking of earlier. So if the student does have an unusual circumstance, then it'll prompt them with the message of them and the FAFSA will state, sorry, provisionally independent student or unaccompanied homeless youth. It'll let them know that they can proceed without parents' information. To complete this financial aid process, you will need to contact the financial aid office at the college or career school if they wish to attend. So they don't need to contact every single school that they list on the FAFSA. But let's just say, if they decided that they're going to, for example, UIC, then they would contact UIC or to see what documentation they need from the student. All right, so now for the scenarios, let me just open up my polls here. So Mary is the senior in high school and has a 6-month-old child. After she had her child, she decided to move out of her parents' house. Mary works and covers most of her child's expenses. Mary plans to still live on her own and commute to the local community college to earn an associate's degree. Her sister plans to help when needed until she earns her degree. So now let me just open up the poll. Is Mary considered a dependent or independent for purposes of the FAFSA? Let me see. Let me just open up. Sorry, y'all, I mentioned this is okay. There you go. So you do have 1 minute. All right. So now let's see. Good, yeah. So Mary would be considered independent for purposes of the FAFSA, and Mary would not need to report her parents' information. So in the scenario, it is stated that Mary does have a child that lives with her. Mary does provide more than half of the support. As it states here, Mary works and covers most of her child's expenses. Mary plans to still live on her own and commute to the local community college. She does receive some assistance from her sister, but it doesn't sound like she receives more than half of the support. So again, even though she's receiving some support, it's just minor, right? But as I mentioned earlier, even in my example a few slides ago, because Mary is providing over 50% of that support, she is considered independent and can proceed without parent information. All right. So now, Paul and his mom were recently evicted from the apartment they lived in. Paul and his mom decided to go to a shelter while they figure out their living situation. Paul has received a determination letter from his high school's homeless district liaison stating Paul is homeless but not unaccompanied. So this is a two-part question. Is Paul considered dependent or independent for FAFSA purposes? And if dependent, who should Paul report on the FAFSA for parental information? Now, let me open up the poll. Let's see. Okay. So let's see how everyone did on this one. Really good. Yes. So Paul is considered dependent for the FAFSA purposes. He has a determination letter from the homeless district liaison. However, as I mentioned earlier, Paul is not unaccompanied because he's still in custody of his mom. So even though he is in a shelter, he is with his mother, therefore he would provide his mom's information, and mom would then be required to report her 2024 tax information on the FAFSA. But yes, I'm so happy that everyone's doing so good. All right. George. George is a senior in high school. When George was 6, his parents passed away. George entered foster care immediately and was adopted at the age of 9. At the age of 18, he moved out and supports himself financially. He is now filling out the FAFSA and is confused by the dependency question and whose information he needs to report, if anyone's. So this is again a two-part question. So the first part is George considered a dependent or independent for purposes of the FAFSA, and if dependent, who should George report on the FAFSA for parental information? So now let me open up. Question. And then for most of these, you do have a minute before the poll closes. All right, let's see how everyone did. Mm. Oh, this question got some of y'all. Okay, let's go over it. So George would be considered a dependent purpose for purposes of the FAFSA because he was in foster care, but he was adopted before the age of 13. So remember, it was that at or after the age of 13, George will report information about his adoptive parents. So sometimes, if let's just say if George did have foster parents, he would not report them as parents for FAFSA purposes. It would be his adoptive parents. And again, he would have to report that because of that age. So it says um, George entered foster care immediately and was adopted at the age of 9. So he was already with his adoptive parents by the time he was 13. So therefore, he would need to report parent information. So this was a 50-50. It did get some people, but again, it's that age of 13, it sometimes throws a lot of people off, including myself. Um, so just keep in mind it's at or after the age of 13. All right. Jennifer is a DACA student. She has a social security number and is looking to fill out a FAFSA. She is unsure if she qualifies for any federal aid. Jennifer believes she qualifies for need-based aid due to her family's financial situation. She started her FAFSA but is confused about how to answer the question about citizenship. If Jennifer submits her FAFSA, is she considered a U.S. citizen, an eligible non-citizen, or a non-eligible non-citizen? So let me open up this poll. Okay. Oof. Okay. I'm gonna go over this one. So because Jennifer has DACA, Jennifer is considered a non-eligible non-citizen. So a few slides back, I mentioned or I stated that DACA recipients are not eligible for the FAFSA. However, if they in the state of Illinois, they would then be referred to the alternative app to read and go through those pre-screening questions to see if they are eligible for the alt app instead. Um, However, again, the DACA recipients are not eligible, so then they would answer the question that asks what the student's citizenship status is. The Jennifer in this case would answer, no, I am a non-eligible non-citizen. So that's how she would answer that citizenship question. Uh, and again, she would just be instructed to fill out or go through the pre-screening questions on the alt app in the state of Illinois. Um, and as I mentioned, in some states, that they use the FAFSA to award institutional aid. So if this wasn't the state of Illinois, right, Jennifer would then select that question as non-eligible non-citizen once she's filing the FAFSA for institutional aid purposes. But again, for the state of Illinois, we would then refer them to the ALT app to see if they're eligible for that. All right. So now to go over parental and financial information. So who is a parent for FAFSA purposes, right? So for financial aid purposes, a parent is considered if they're biological, adoptive, a step parents only if they're married or while married to the biological parents. If the parents are living together, in those cases where parents are living together but are unmarried, then they would both have to provide information on the FAFSA. Now, within these past 2 years, FAFSA has made it more streamlined to understand which parent goes on the application. So, for instance, for the 26-27, the student invites one parent. That parent contributor fills out the application. If information is needed from the second parent, then the first contributor parent would be then prompted to send the invite to that second parent. But again, if they are unmarried or living together, or sorry, unmarried but living together, then both parents would go on the FAFSA. Another instance where both parents would be required is if they are marrying, filing taxes separately. Essentially, I mean, both information is required from them in general, but remember with taxes that are married filing jointly, that's one tax return, so it includes the same information for both parents. So that's why for those parents who are filing separately, they both need to report their individual information because it's two separate tax returns. If you are working with a student who has, for example, divorced parents, they must report information of the parent who provided the most financial support in the last 12 months. Now, if you do have parents who they're letting you know right away that they're split down the middle, right? So 50-50, then the parent with the greater income or assets would be the one that reports their information on the FAFSA. Sometimes parents will say like, yes, they'll split it down 50-50. Some parents will let you know like, well, actually I pay for school uniforms or I pay for, food because I have him during the weekdays. So just when their parents are disclosing more information like that, most of the times there is one parent who is providing more than half of that support. But some, if it's on the court order that it's 50-50, then you would go with the greater income or assets. And then for those, I just want to remind everyone that for those who have a legal guardian, right, or, legal guardians are not considered parents. Grandparents are not considered parents. Aunts and uncles are not considered parents. So for the purposes of financial aid only, these are considered parents. If they have anything else, they would then, if they have a legal guardian and they have that court document, they would then be considered independent. Therefore, they would not need to report any parent information. So with the financial information that is required from the IRS, it's the federal tax information. So tax returns like 1040, any income earned from work, additional financial information, any untaxed income, investments. If they're asked, there is the investment exclusion provision that we'll go over in a bit. But again, they would then report businesses and investment farms if they are prompted to report that. So the information from tax returns, so the parents and so the parent will be asked, right, if they did file a tax return, and the student they will be asked if they have already completed a return, if they will file but have not yet completed a return, or if they're not going to file. In those instances where parents, or students, right, don't make enough of they're at the income threshold where they're not required to report or file any taxes, then they would then say they're not going to file. The FAFSA will then prompt them up with additional options where they can choose, like they're not going to file because they were under the income threshold to file any taxes. If they already complete a return and they select yes, and they proceed to the next question. For the financial information from the taxes, it's going to ask what their filing status is. So if they file single, head of household, married filing jointly, married filing separately, etc. Their AGI, which is their adjusted gross income. This includes any earned and unearned income, any U.S. income tax paid, and this refers to the U.S. tax paid, not the tax refund that parents receive at the end of, or at the beginning of the year, right? So when like tax season, when they're receiving it's not that number. They don't report that number on the FAFSA, or any federal income tax withheld as noted on the W-2 form. So the income tax paid would be found on Form 1040, line 24. If the number is a negative, then they would just treat it as a zero. And then again, reporting that total federal income tax, not the total taxes. So this is and I mentioned it briefly earlier on, the consent for the direct data exchange, or the DDX. Parents and students both need to provide that consent and approval in order for the IRS to retrieve for the direct data exchange to retrieve all the tax information, and it'll auto-populate some of the questions that students and parents need to answer on the FAFSA. Now this will only work for parents, this won't work for parents who have ITIN numbers. They do still have to provide that consent and approval, but if you're working with parents that have an ITIN, they will still need to report all of that information manually. So good rule of thumb is just to have parents bring all those W-2s, those 1040s, any additional schedules in case they do have to report information manually, just so they have that handy. So many income requirements will be imported directly from the IRS when that consent is provided, right? Including wages, any salaries, tips earned from work. They must be reported whether a tax return was filed. So if you are in the instances where parents don't file a tax return, but they made some sort of income, it is going to prompt them it is going to ask them, what was their income earned from work. Therefore, they could put just the income that they earned. And that could be found if they didn't file taxes, that could be found in their W-2 so that they could enter that into the FAFSA. For the untaxed income components, so the deductions and payments to self-employment, simple KIA, and other qualified individual retirement accounts are excluded from the income for federal tax purposes. So all those retirement accounts not accounted as income, but excluding payments made to tax-deferred pension and retirement plans paid directly or withheld from earnings that are not on the federal tax return. So this also includes tax-exempt interest income, the untaxed portion of individual retirement account distribution, excluding rollovers, the untaxed portion of pensions, excluding rollovers, and the foreign earned income exclusion. So it's going to ask about all of these. A good rule of thumb is if the parent is unsure of what this is, right? What is a KIA? What is a simple plan? Then they might not have it, or they don't have it. If that is the case, they would just put zeros down. This is a very common question that we receive out in the field. Most parents and students put zeros since they don't have any of this. So these are the allowances against income. So earnings from federal work study. The money that a student makes working under federal work study will not be counted against them as income for federal financial aid purposes. Any institutional grants and scholarship aid included in the AGI on a federal tax return, including amounts attributable to a grant and scholarship portions of fellowships and assistantships, as well as AmeriCorps benefits, including awards, living allowances, and interest accrual payments. The American Opportunity or Lifetime Learning Education Tax Credit amount claimed on the federal tax return. The payroll tax allowance includes both Medicare and Social Security taxes as part of the SAI calculation. So it takes that into consideration. And then the federal income tax paid, the federal income tax paid, the employment expenses allowance, and the income protection allowance, so the IPA, which we know that now with the income protection allowance, the FAFSA is not taking into consideration whether there's multiple kids in college. However, the income protection allowance has been increased to sort of match that. Now it's not considering, multiple dependents in college. So now the income protection allowance was increased to uphold that change. With reporting investment information, as I mentioned earlier, the investment questions will not be asked for those who make less than $60,000 a year. If they did not file a schedule A, B, D, E, F, or H, there's so many. They did not file a schedule C with a net business income of not more than $10,000 of loss or gain. If at any time during 2024 or 2025, the parent or the student or anyone in the family received a means tested federal benefit, such as like Medicaid, SNAP benefits, a student with a negative SAI, which qualifies for Max Pell. So so if any of these students meet these requirements, those investment questions, they will not see them, because they are under the, threshold. However, with the new changes, I did wanted to include this as well. If you are working with parents or students who are required to report investments, then they would exclude the net worth of any business on a family farm if they are under 100 employees, full-time or equivalent. So if they do have over 100 employees and they would report that as an investment, they would then exclude the home in which the students or family live in, or any child support received for the most recent calendar year. They would also exclude the commercial fishing businesses if they have one, but these are the new, sorry, I read that wrong. But with the new One Big Beautiful Bill Act, if they are required to report investments, they would exclude those. And again, if they do have that family business, but they have 100 or more employees, then they would report that as an investment. Some investments included would be the 529 college savings plans, only reported if the account is designated for the student. So in those cases where you have multiple children, right? So let's say I have 3 children and I have a 529 plan for each child. I would only report the 529 plan for the child that is filing or filling out the FAFSA, right? So if child number 1 is the one filling it out, that would be the 529 that I'm reporting. I know I don't have to report the other 2 529 plans until it's their turn. Any bonds, any certificates of deposit, education savings accounts designated for the student, installment and land sale contracts, any money market funds, child support received, mutual funds, real estate, rental property. This includes a unit with a family home that has its own entrance, kitchen, and bath rented to a non-family member. So with rental properties, sometimes you do have those multiple apartments, or you have those homes that are like 3 flats. Now that gets a little tricky with how it gets reported, because you could be living in one flat, you could have your grandparent living in another one, but then you have a friend living in the third one, right? So then you would report the flat that that friend lives on. And then it'll be the net worth minus any debt. That would be what is reported. Any stocks or stock options, trust funds, or any UGMA or UDMA accounts. Investments do exclude the home in which the student lives in. So I've actually seen this a lot, where parents do report the home in which the student lives in. Again, this is not reported as an investment. As I mentioned just a few seconds ago, it does get a little tricky with those like 4 flat homes or 3 flat homes, because you do have to do some sort of math to divide the uh, total worth minus the debt. You do have to divide that all up to determine what needs to be reported for those 3 flat apartments. The value of life insurance, the value of ABLE accounts, value of retirement plans, which includes 401k plans, pension funds, annuities, non-education IRAs, and key-out plans. So all of those are not considered investments, and the parents don't need to report that. For businesses, investments, and farm values, any land, buildings, livestock, machinery, equipment, inventory. So again, it's the current value minus any debt gives you the net worth of what you would be reporting for that business. I just realized I might have switched it around earlier, but again, current value minus any debt owed equals the net worth. This is the formula, as you would say, for determining what the parent would report on that investment or asset. They would report the net worth for real estate and rental property, debts for which the business or investment farms was used as collateral. If net worth is either zero or a negative number, the amount would not be reported. Um, so for those rental properties, as I mentioned before, those 3 flats, 4 flats, it'll be the current value minus debt equals the net worth. They do have to do some math right there. Same thing with businesses and investment farms. They would then count as, again, what do they use for that farm, right? Especially if the student is not residing in that farm and the farm is used for commercial purposes, they would count everything that they use in their business, right? So any machines, any livestock, all of that, if they have debt owed against that farm, right? So if they have like a loan or something like that, they would factor that in the formula, then they would get their net worth. All right, so now for the second part of these scenarios. And then just a hint, we're going to use the current value minus debt equals net worth. So just keep that in mind for the scenarios portion. Oh, all right. Peter is a senior in high school and has been living with his older sister ever since their parents were both deported over a year ago. Peter has the option of either staying in the US with his sister or leaving the country to be with his parents. Peter decided that he wanted to stay in the US with his sister. Peter's sister has a letter stating that she is his legal guardian for school purposes. Peter is filling out the FAFSA and is confused about what to put in the parent section. Is Peter considered a dependent or independent student for FAFSA purposes? And if dependent, whose information should Peter report on the FAFSA? All right. So is Peter considered a dependent or independent? Okay, so let's go over this. Um, Peter would be considered a dependent student for purposes of the FAFSA and would need to include his parents' information. Even though Peter is living with his sister, she is not considered a parent for purposes of the FAFSA. Remember, so it's biological parents, adoptive, and step parents if they're married to biological or adoptive parents. Peter's sister does not have legal guardianship as determined by a court, and Peter would provide his parents information and convert them to US dollars. So because Peter, remember, he's not homeless, he's not unaccompanied, um, he would need to then, or sorry, yeah, he's not homeless. He would then need to, he has contact with his parents. He would need to report his parents' information if they are living, let's just say, I mean, I'm Mexican, so at the top of my head, I could think Mexico. Let's just say his parents are in Mexico. He would convert the currency, which is pesos, to dollars. And then that's what, once he gets that dollar, whatever dollar it is or dollar amounts, he would then report that on the, or his parents will report that on the FAFSA. All right. For Jasmine, she is a senior in high school and her parents are divorced. She lives with her mother during the weekdays and her father on the weekends. Her mother has a boyfriend that does not live with them. The father owns the house they live in and financially provides for both Jasmine and her mother due to the divorce settlement. Jasmine's father recently remarried and now has a stepmother. Both Jasmine's father and her stepmother work full time. Jasmine's father claims Jasmine on her taxes. Jasmine is now filling out the FAFSA and is confused about who she should report or include on the parents section on the form. Who should Jasmine report on the FAFSA for parental purposes? So now let me open up the poll. Um, okay. Yep. Okay. All right. So who should Jasmine report? So now let's see the results. Okay. All right. So Jasmine will report her father and her stepmom's information because, as the scenario stated, the dad just recently remarried and now Jasmine has a stepmom. So then, because father is the one that provides most of the financial support because he's paying for the house that Jasmine and her mom are living in, and it sounds like he's paying for majority of the things that are included, in Jasmine. Therefore, he's the one that goes on the FAFSA. Because he did remarry, then now stepmom's information also goes on the FAFSA. It doesn't matter if, Jasmine lives with mom. So in some instances, you will have that, right? Where students live with one of the parents, but that parent is not providing most of that financial support. So therefore, uh, it requires the second parent, right? Because if the second parent is the one that's paying for rent or mortgage, food, etc., then that's the parent that's providing the financial support, even though they're not actually living with the student most of the time. Carlos is a senior in high school and has 3 younger siblings. His parents own and run a bakery with 10 employees regularly. His parents' income is $55,000 a year. His father has a sizable 401k and has a pension fund. Carlos owns 4 vending machines to try and begin his entrepreneurship endeavors. Carlos is the oldest first and his family's first time completing a FAFSA, and they are not sure about what needs to be reported as an investment. Which, if any, investments listed would need to report it on the FAFSA? So what investments, if any, would Carlos have to report? Let's see. Right, let's view the results. Okay, so we'll go over this question. So the retirement plans and pension funds are not considered investments for purposes of the FAFSA. Remember, 401ks, any pension funds are not considered investments or reported as investments. The value of possessions are not considered an investment for purposes of the FAFSA. So Carlos's vending machines, those are his possessions. He's starting his business. His business is a startup, so he's not generating any income just yet. So those are not considered investments for purposes of the FAFSA. The value of the family bakery by Carlos's parents should not be reported as investments on the FAFSA because they meet one of the 3 exemptions, which reporting any investments under the application. So it said here, Carlos's parents, which Carlos is a dependent student, therefore it would his parents would be the ones that have to make either 60K or less than or more than 60K. In this case, they make $55,000 a year from their bakery, which means they wouldn't even be asked about investment questions. However, in the case that, right, let's just say Carlos's parents did make over 60K, with these new provisions under the OBBBA, they would still not report the bakery because it is a family business and it has 10 employees regularly. Remember, it has to be 100 or fewer full-time employees to be excluded as an investment. If there was 100 or more, then they would report it. But again, even now with the new provisions, if Carlos's family made $55,000, they still would not report, or sorry, if Carlos's family made over that $60,000, they still would not report that bakery because they have 10 employees running that bakery. So it gets a little tricky, but I hope that that cleared some questions up for you all. Samantha's parents are required to report investment information. They own a 4-flat apartment building, so this will require a little bit of math, so you want to get your calculators out. They own a 4-flat building in the city. The current value of the building is $800,000, and her parents have $400,000 worth of debt on it. Each unit has its own entrance, kitchen, and bath. Samantha and her parents live on the main floor. Samantha's grandparents rent one unit, and her cousins rent the other. And the third one, or the fourth one, is being rented out to a family friend. So remember, there's 4 units, or it's a 4 flat. Samantha lives in one. Samantha's grandparents live in the other one. Samantha's cousin lives in the third one. And then they have a family friend that's renting out that fourth and final unit. Samantha's parents also own a separate rental property aside from the one that they live in next door. Samantha's filling out her FAFSA and is not sure whether to report the 4 flat the family owns and lives in as an investment as well as the separate property. So 2-part question, right? So the first question is, what is the value reported on the FAFSA for the 4 flat apartment building? And does the separate rental property get reported? So you do have about a minute and a half for this one. But before I post it, I'll let you all read over it and start doing the math. I'll give you a heads up. All right, so I'm going to post the question. And again, you do have a minute and a half for this question. All right. Sorry, my computer froze a little bit. Okay, so some of you all got the question right. So Samantha's parents would need to report $100,000 as an investment for purposes of the FAFSA. So remember, the home in which they live in is not considered an investment for purposes of the FAFSA. The rental property includes a unit with a family home rented to a non-family member. So that 4th floor is being rented out to a family friend, and the other 2 are rented to Samantha's grandparents, who are considered family. And then the cousins, who are also considered family, so the unit is excluded. The net worth of the unit rented to the family friend is the one that just needs to be reported. And again, the formula is current value minus debt equals the net worth. So we have the current value of the home, which was stated that it was $800,000. They do have $400,000 worth of debt on the building. So then they would subtract that debt, which would give them $400,000. Because there are 4 units, they would then take that $400,000 and divide it by those 4 units, which will give them the value of $100,000 for each unit. So because most of those units are excluded because they're rented out to family, or sorry, to family, and then Samantha lives in the other one, they would not report the first three, but the last unit that's rented out to the family friend would be the one that is reported, and that is only $100,000. So therefore, Samantha's parents would only need to report $100,000 for that unit. Now, the separate rental property should be reported as an investment. So the way they would do it is the net worth minus any current value, or sorry, the current value minus any debt equals net worth. I get confused all the time, sorry. And that's what they would report on the other separate rental property. Sounds like Samantha's parents only are renting that property to non-family members, therefore they would then need to do, they don't have to exclude any numbers out. But again, just want to be clear, they would report $100,000 for the unit that they live in. All right. Thank you all for bearing with me with the polls. So now for some resources. So we all know with the new direct admissions program, which is One Click College Admit, which directs it's free direct admissions program for public universities and community colleges. It removes any traditional barriers like essays, and there's no application fees as well. The eligibility is based on the student's high school GPA. And currently, for this year, there are two versions available of this program, which is the 1.0. This is the program, the 1.0 is the program that current seniors, so the class of 2026, will have to opt in for. After this current school year, the 25-26, 1.0 will be transitioning out, and we would only stay with One Click Admit 2.0, which is for the class of 2027, which is the current juniors. So current juniors can opt in to the 2.0 program. Again, so after the 25-26 school year, 1.0 phases out, 2.0 becomes the One Click College Admit program. There won't be no 1.0 or 2.0. So for current high school seniors with the 1.0, this process came out of a pilot phase which started in January of this year. It's only for high school students for the class of 2026. It does include 8 public and 8 community colleges who are currently participating in the 1.0. For the public universities, it's easier to remember the ones that are not currently participating, which is UIC, UIUC, ISU, and UIS, right? So those 4 are not participating in the 1.0 program. It does rely on self-reported GPA, so the student does need to report their own GPA, and this will be done through the Common App. So high school students would, as normal, create their account with the Common App, or their Common App account. Then they would indicate their permanent home address in Illinois, so because that would then make them eligible for the free Illinois admissions program, enter their GPA and GPA scale. Then Common App would run those matches. They're set to match those and process those weekly. After that, then the student would receive an email regarding any direct admissions offers sent to the student. And if email was provided on the Common App account for any parent or guardian, an email will be sent to them as well. Students then would act on the direct admissions offer inside the Common App. So if the student did want to act on one of the school choices, then they would move that school to My Colleges. So the way it looks like in the Common App is the student will see on their left-hand side on the dashboard, they will see a tab where it says direct admissions. They will see all the offers from Illinois first, especially because they stated that they are permanent residents of Illinois, followed by any other direct admissions programs that outside of Illinois that might be going on. They'll receive those offers as well. They'll be able to see those. However, they'll always see Illinois first. So let's say they want to act on one school, then they would then move that school to My Colleges and follow that process as normal. So the universities and colleges are only Um, again, so that's the only way that the universities or colleges will be aware is if the student moves that college to my colleges. And then students submit their application via Common App. So same as what they're doing now. For the current high school juniors, which is the 2.0 program, this was a process defined by House Bill 3522. This is high school and community college students included. It does include the 10 public universities and all of the Illinois community colleges. With the 10 public universities, not that it's excluding UIUC and UIC, but they have a different required eligibility, so they have more of an outreach plan. So if the student meets the standards or eligibility requirements for UIUC and UIC, then UIUC or UIC will send them an email to formally apply. This one, the 2.0 does use verified GPA. So high school juniors must opt in to allow their GPAs to be sent to ISAC for that matching process. Universities must provide the ISAC minimum GPA to match by March 1st of 2026, and it will be every March thereafter. So the date stays consistent. UIUC and UIC have to provide the access criteria to ISAC by February of 2026, and same thing every February thereafter. Now on the high school side, they have to provide the GPA of juniors by July after the junior year. And then ISAC will match for direct admissions. ISAC will provide match data for Common App for high school students, and then Common App will email the student with direct admissions offers. High school seniors will then accept their offers via Common App. ISAC will provide universities and colleges names of contact info for students who receive direct admissions offers to their institutions. And just keep in mind, this is just a direct admissions program. This is not meant to supplement any form or any financial aid program. So the student still needs to complete a FAFSA or alternative application. If they're not eligible for the FAFSA and they're eligible for the LTAP. So just keep in mind, it's not meant to supplement any financial aid program. The student still needs to follow those as normal. For the opt-in process, the data collected that's used is the student's name, the home address, which must be the Illinois address, the birth date, the phone number, email address, high school or community college that the student is attending, the college ID number and this is for community college students. There are optional demographic questions for high school students only, which just identifies those first generation students, the race and ethnicity, gender, and any ISAC Q&A sign up. For the key direct admissions, they have the opt-in platform for high school juniors, which started in August the 15th of this year. And just keep in mind, with the opt-in for juniors, they have to opt in their junior year. If next year, right, these juniors become seniors and they want to opt in, they can no longer opt in because they do need to opt in that junior year. By March 2026, there will be some spring webinars and updates on GPA data transfer. I know there's a lot of questions surrounding that GPA data transfer, and we will have some information and updates in the spring for you all. Then May 22nd is when the opt-in form will close. This is literally the weekend before Memorial Day. So it's, again, a memorable date. It's right before the holiday that the opt-in platform will close. And then by July 1st, it's the deadline for the high schools to submit that GPA of students who opted in to ISAC. And then by September 15, the students will get notified of their direct admissions offers and instructions for next steps. So the students will start receiving those direct admissions offers as early as September, mid-September. So now there are a few resources for One-Click College at MIT to help families navigate the process. So there are FAQs for juniors, FAQs for seniors. There's also a step-by-step guide. There's some webinar recordings last month. There's a lot of information on One-Click College at MIT. Last month there was a lot of webinars on this, so you could find some of those recordings there. And also download materials for counselors. It just includes that information of what is needed, the step-by-step, So it's very useful information for parents and students. There's also the First Generation Scholars Network, which is a free resource for students who will be the first in their family to earn a college degree. So the first gen just allows them to connect, and it's a community, right? So it allows them to connect with other first gen students, connect with a first gen mentor, finding any first gen programs on campus if there are any. It's pretty cool. They also, if they sign up, they do get some freebies. There's also the Illinois College Access Network called short of for or Illinois CAN for short. Same thing is the community, right? But for college access practitioners that strives to improve post-secondary access and success for low-income and first-generation students. You can join today to be a member. Illinois CAN focuses on 4 objectives, which is increasing visibility of Illinois college access programs and services, disseminating college access research and best practices, providing professional development and technical assistance for college access providers, and facilitating communication and collaboration among college access providers. So very cool. There's we host the meetings quarterly. And it's just a very good space and environment for just to see what other schools are doing all across the state of Illinois. It's good networking. There's the FAFSA communication toolkit. As we all know, the FAFSA is live. So this is a resource to assist practitioners with the communication that goes out to families. So the toolkit has the emails to, it has like some templates of emails that you can send to families in English and Spanish. It has any like flyers that you can use to host financial aid workshops and to market those. So it has a lot of useful templates that practitioners can use. We also have the ISAC connection, which is a number for only for college access practitioners. It's only for practitioners. This is not the number for students. So this is where those counselors can ask questions. Maybe they're helping a student out filling out the FAFSA and they just have a quick question. They can text, the counselor can text this number and they'll be someone will reply to them. And it's not AI, it's actually a person behind that phone number texting the counselor back. So if you want to take a quick screenshot of that. And finally, we do have our CEs and PDs for today. The barcode is on the slide, and then my colleague Crystal just posted it on the link on the chat. We do, so to request CEs and PDs, they must be submitted by 4:30 on Friday. If you are requesting PD, we just ask that you please submit your Illinois Educator Identification Number, so your EIN. And I'll leave it on this slide, but thank you all for your time, and have a good rest of your day.